Order. We now come to a very important debate on the sentencing in cases of dangerous driving involving death, and I invite Kevin Brennan to move the motion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hollowbone, and it is a great pleasure to serve under your wise chairmanship as ever. And this debate obviously is quite timely, as honourable members will know and the Minister will know, given the publication yesterday on the 16th of October of the response to the government's consultation to the maximum sentences for particular driving offences. And obviously today, inevitably and rightly, our debate is informed by the changes that the government have announced yesterday. But like other members, I think many other members, I've sought this debate in response to a case in my own constituency where the perpetrator was convicted after pleading guilty to causing death by dangerous driving. Now, I do understand and sympathise with the Minister, as a former Minister myself, that he won't be able to comment on individual cases in his response. But my aim today is to use this tragic case as an example to question whether the current sentencing regime is fit for purpose, to discuss some of the government's proposals and changes that they're bringing forward, and to discuss how this case and ones like it need to lead to a change in policy. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I thank the honourable member for allowing me this intervention. I'm sure many will know of the sad case of 4-year-old Violet Grace-Ewens, who was killed this year, and her grandmother left seriously injured and returning from the nursery, when a stolen car crashed into them at 80 miles an hour in a 30-mile zone in St Helens. 2 young men in the car, one driving, one not. One of them ran past dying Violet Grace while she was dying, laughing, making his gateway. Another one has been posted videos from his prison cell celebrating his birthday in prison, and it depicts drug taking and misbehaviour in prison. One will understand how those parents are deeply distressed and to have no faith in our justice system. A boy who's celebrating his birthday, posted on the video, received a 10 days extension to his sentence. I've read with interest your proposals and welcome them, but please take consideration of those that may not have been on drugs and drink at that time. But thank you. Thank you.
Can I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and obviously that is a horrendous case, and a great deal needs to be done with regard to our prisons policy. It's not for us to debate that here today, but there's much to be done to improve the state of affairs in our prisons at the current time. But I want to go on, and I sympathise with her constituents and their families. I want to go on to talk about Sophie Taylor, who was a 22-year-old constituent of mine, a young woman at the prime of her life, with much to look forward to, who was described by her distraught mother, Jackie, as a loving and caring individual. And I want to pay tribute to Jackie for somehow finding the strength to come and talk to me about the case and to the media about her horrific loss and her experience of the criminal justice and the court system subsequently. And during the hours of the morning of August the 22nd, 2016, Sophie and her friend, Joshua Duguara, were chased through the streets of Cardiff by her ex-boyfriend, Michael Wheeler, and another driver. Now, I won't comment, Mr Hollowbone, on the case of the second driver, because there are elements of that case that might still be sub judice, but I will focus on the actions and sentencing of Michael Wheeler, who entered a guilty plea and whose case is not subject to appeal. Now, during the chase, Sophie called 999 because she was scared and she felt unsafe. She was on the phone talking to an operator during that time for 24 minutes. And as this duration shows, this chase was sustained and a deliberate action by Mr. Wheeler. During this time, his car reached speeds of up to 56 miles per hour as he chased Sophie and Joshua into narrow residential streets. And then he turned his car to the left into Sophie's, causing her car to crash into a block of flats. The collision caused Sophie a catastrophic brain injury, which led to her death. And Joshua suffered life-changing injuries, including a brain bleed, shattered pelvis, and an injury to his leg that has since led to its amputation. The news reports stated that Mr. Wheeler drove away after the crash before parking nearby where he was arrested. The judge who heard the case, Mr. Hollowbone, at Cardiff Crown Court, described what happened that night, and I quote, as nothing more than a pack chasing its prey. And he added, you were trying to ram her off the road, and you did. It's also worth noting that Sophie had made several reports to the police and visited the police station in the weeks leading up to her death in relation to problems that she was experiencing with Mr. Wheeler. It was an act of decisive, prolonged and coordinated aggression, and in my view, one which should have led to a even more serious charge than causing death by dangerous driving. But the judge was clear, and he said, you were consumed by a self-righteous and jealous rage, chasing her down to frighten her and teach her a lesson. And we can only imagine the loss that Sophie's family has suffered and the stress and the torment that they've endured throughout the legal process. And as I said earlier, I've met with her mother, Jackie, and she's understandably absolutely devastated by what happened, but equally determined, Mr. Hollowbone, to do what she can to prevent other families having to go through what her family has suffered. Now, as I said previously, I completely understand that the Minister can't comment on individual cases. However, I think the details of the case that I've outlined are extremely pertinent in discussing the sentences of cases of death by dangerous driving. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Thank you very much for giving way and for tabling this important debate. Members might know of an incident that happened in my constituency in Penge last year when two of my constituents, Micaiah McDermott, a 10-year-old boy, an aspiring young actor, and his aunt, Rosie Cooper, were killed when a car was travelling, a stolen vehicle was travelling at 55 miles an hour in a residential area just opposite a play park. And this case is particularly close to my heart because I was at school with the mother of the boy that died and his aunt that died. Will you agree with me that the disparity between sentences for manslaughter and sentences for death by dangerous driving has long been unjust?
Yes, I do agree with that, as a matter of fact, and again, I extend my sympathies to my honourable friend and her constituents in relation to that tragic case. But what I'm going to go on and try and develop in my argument a little bit is that it's not enough just to get parity of sentence. We need to look at what sentences are actually being handed out and why they're being handed out, and whether or not justice is really being served currently by the system, whatever the ultimate maximum tariff that the government decides is appropriate in relation to this offence. Now, the details of the case, as I said, are pertinent. The maximum sentence, as honourable members know, currently for causing death by dangerous driving has been raised in recent years. It's now 14 years in custody. And I note in the guidelines that Sentencing Council characterise a level 1 conviction for causing death by dangerous driving as, and I quote, a deliberate decision to ignore, then in brackets, or flagrant disregard for, close brackets, the rules of the road and an apparent disregard for the great danger being caused to others. Now, given that Sophie was deliberately and persistently chased through the streets of Cardiff and forced off the road in the way that ultimately led to her death, it seems to me that a level 1 sentence would have to apply in this case. However, whilst the starting point for a level 1 conviction is 8 years in custody, Mr. Hollowbone, Wheeler was sentenced to 7.5 years, which is just over half the maximum sentence available. Now, it's my constituent Jackie Taylor's understanding that the guidelines available to the judge didn't allow for the maximum sentence to be given, despite the obvious aggressive and aggravating factors leading up to this particular case. The Justice Secretary did say to me in a reply to a letter that I sent to him in relation to this case that the courts must follow sentencing guidelines, and I quote, unless it is not in the interest of justice to do so. Which leads Mr. Hollowbone to an obvious question. How could it be in the interest of justice to opt for a lower sentence in a case like the one that I've outlined to the House today? The sentence following Sophie Taylor's death poses real questions, I think, about the frequency and circumstances of the use of the maximum sentence currently, which are particularly timely, given that the government's made this announcement that it's increasing, or intends to increase the maximum sentence from 14 years to life in cases of death by dangerous driving. Now, the first issue, I think, is around how often that maximum sentence is used. In my previous correspondence with the Justice Secretary on this matter, I asked how many maximum sentences for causing death by dangerous driving have been handed out in recent years. And I noticed actually yesterday, Mr. Hollowbone, in the government's press release in relation to its announcement about the maximum sentence, that in 2016, 157 people were sentenced for causing death by dangerous driving. Now, in the response to my letter, and it isn't normally like the Honourable Member, the Justice Secretary, he didn't respond to that direct question that I put to him in the letter as to how many maximum sentences for causing death by dangerous driving have been handed out in recent years. He simply said it was rarely used, the maximum sentence. So I wonder if the Minister, when he does respond today, could actually give us that figure. Because I did look very carefully in the government's press release to see if it was there, but it wasn't within the press release. And I would say gently to the Minister that these things, these sensitive matters, should be very carefully proofread, because in the notes to editors of the press release, the final point says, and I quote, "The government will give further consideration to increasing minimum driving bans for those convicted of causing serious death." Now, I'm sorry, Mr. Hollowbone. You know, it's not really acceptable, and I know it's an error, but it's not really acceptable in something as sensitive as this to make that kind of crass error. I'll give way to the Honourable.
My honourable friend, I think, is getting to the fundamental point here. This week, Merseyside Road Safety Partnership announced a strategy to dramatically reduce road deaths by 2020. But preventative measures, I'm sure my honourable friend would agree, are only useful and good if those who cause death by dangerous driving know they are going to be dealt with very harshly by the law.
That's right.
Well, I think justice should be served by the right sentence being given for the right offence, and there should also be an anticipation that you are likely also to be caught and that justice will be served upon you. And I think the Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right. Without that being clear, then I think these kinds of offences will continue to happen. Now, as I said, I hope the Minister can at least give us that figure today, because I think the public are entitled to know that. And my constituent, Jackie Taylor, in fact, when she read the Justice Secretary's response, said, and I quote, "I note that the Right Honourable David Lidington, CBE MP, mentions about the government in consultation on driving offences and penalties relating to causing death and serious injury, possibly increasing to life imprisonment. This will only deem as a deterrent, not deal with the offence committed. If 14 years has never been passed down to any individual for this charge, why would life imprisonment ever be used? If the Sentencing Council control what the judges can serve and are recommended low guidelines in the criteria that the judges work with, then what difference will it make if it's life?" And I think that's a very reasonable question for my constituent as a victim of this kind of crime to pose to the government. And I hope the Minister, in his response, is able to deal with that matter when he responds to the debate. Now, obviously, I'm interested in how often the sentence has been given that the government's consultation showed that 70% of respondents didn't feel that 14 years currently was long enough. And the Minister will understand that if the sentence of 14 years was hardly ever used, it raises a question about how a new increased maximum would be used and why it was found to be necessary. So I wonder if the government's made any estimate of how often it anticipates that the new maximum sentence is likely to be given on current experience and given its consultation. And likewise, what effect does he think that the new maximum will have on the average sentence for causing death by dangerous driving? Because if there isn't an answer to those questions, then the obvious question would be, what is the point of the proposed change? Now, in 2015, with a maximum sentence of 14 years, the average custodial sentence length was 57.1 months. Is there a projection, as the government anticipate, that that will increase in line with the new maximum? The second issue is around the circumstances in which the maximum penalty is used, Mr. Hollowbone. Of course, the maximum sentences and sentences of a similarly lengthy duration are rightly reserved for the most heinous crimes. And I've outlined to the House the horrible circumstances of my constituent's death. But given that Wheeler was sentenced to just over half of the maximum time in custody, her mother's question is, what would someone have to do in relation to causing death by dangerous driving for the maximum sentence to be available if it were not available in a case like this? How will this change as the government changes the maximum sentence? Now, as I've mentioned, my constituent understands that the sentencing guidelines prevented the judge from giving Wheeler the maximum sentence. Indeed, it was reduced by 6 months from the 8-year starting point. Sophie's mother is very concerned about how these sentencing guidelines operate. And I wonder what assessment the Minister's made of the level of accountability of the Sentencing Council. I know it's independent, but it still should be accountable in relation to how it draws up its guidelines. Now, I will very briefly, and then I want to give the Minister a chance to respond.
The Sentencing Council does do really important and valuable work, but does he share with me my concern that when it comes to some of the guidelines, say for the sake of argument, assault occasioning actual bodily harm, which has got a maximum of 5 years, that the Sentencing Council range that it imposes for the most heinous offence stops at well short of that, effectively sending a steer to the judges, don't ever sentence for the maximum. Does he agree with me that's a concern?
I do agree with him that it's a concern, and I think there are similar concerns in relation to this. And, I'm not advocating, in any way that we shouldn't have proper guidelines, because we want consistency in sentencing. But it does seem, I think, to victims, Mr. Hollowbone, sometimes, that the sentence they're told that the perpetrator is likely to get is a bit of a fiction, and there's nothing, and what actually, the tariff that's actually served is nothing like that, and in fact the sentence that's actually given is nothing like the maximum, even in a case like this, where there are horrific aggravating factors. So I'd be grateful if the Minister could address the questions that Sophie Taylor's case poses about the frequency and circumstances in which a maximum sentence is given. And I do want to make it clear, this isn't about revenge, Mr. Hollowbone, it's about justice. Now, sentencing guidelines in this case led to an outcome that not only outraged the victims' families, but also the wider community. And I think the government needs to be clearer on what it's doing to deter this kind of crime. Knowing that a life sentence is a real possibility would be a start. Also ensuring that the likelihood of getting caught is increased by properly funding the police is also a vital part of this. And the prospect of sentences being increased on appeal when judges are too lenient is also very important. I understand, out of 713 such requests, Mr. Hollowbone, in recent years, 136 have resulted in longer sentences, but not one has been for the offence of causing death by dangerous driving. Sophie Taylor's death was a horrible, horrible tragedy. Nothing will relieve her family's loss. However, the perception that justice was not done because the maximum sentence is unreachable adds another burden to bear